Pohang, a city of perfect harmony between history, culture, and contemporary appeal. A city where tradition meets innovation and the past grows alongside the future. Pohang's new challenge. Pohang, the center of the mice industry, opening the door to a new era for the next century.
Distinguished delegates, I am Lee Kang-deok, Mayor of Pohang, Republic of Korea.
It is my great honor to welcome you all to this global knowledge exchange on low carbon steel.
The range of topics was so wide. So in the first group, we really got into a very rich discussion about scrap. And then in other groups, we were talking about policies regarding standards and also GHG emissions.
We do see opportunities, especially in terms of decarbonization.
Governments and private actors must work together to close the financial gap.
We are seeing a lot of interest, and not just interest, we're having commitments already for full project implementation because we have a bankable project.
Whether it's technology, whether it's policy, what we're talking about at the end of the day touches people's life.
Thank you very much for the knowledge, for the experience.
Thank you very much for joining the first session of the Pohang Network Webinar Series. This first session is called The Global Steel Transition, Policy, Technology, and Collaboration, and will be delivered by Isan from Agora Industry and Anna from Mission Possible Partnership. This is meant to be more than a webinar series. It's going to be a community of policymakers, practitioners, financiers, industry experts working on low-carbon steel. And the idea is to create regular touch points for all of us to stay connected, compare progress, and learn from each other as the global transition for low-carbon steel accelerates. Let's start by briefly going to the roots of this community, as we showed in the video as well. At the end of August, many of us met in Pohang alongside the 16th Clean Energy Ministerial for a 2.5-day global exchange on low-carbon steel, which was the first of its kind. Around 90 participants came from more than 20 countries representing governments, industry, finance, NGOs, and international initiatives. We opened with a visit to the POSCO Steel Works, which gave everyone a sense of the scale of an integrated steel plant and reminded us of how central steelmaking has been for the history of Korea. And on the first full day, Thursday, the 28th of August, we explored different scenarios for the steel sector in breakout sessions organized by market clusters. And these conversations fed into wider exchanges on the policies and technologies that can shift both production and demand. And the next day, on Friday, we focused on finance and implementation. Governments, financiers, and industry leaders shared practical examples of what is already happening and also where the gaps remain. And we also spend time mapping the existing clean industry projects and the many global initiatives in the steel space and looking at how they can reinforce each other. And this will be the session that we will zoom into a few months later today. These are a few additional photos from the event, where we heard from many country representatives, industry leaders, civil society, finance, and each session was set up to encourage open discussion. And by the end of the webinar, we had managed to hear from almost everyone in the audience. But after the knowledge exchange, participants shared a clear message that they wanted a space to stay connected, exchange updates, and keep learning from one another. So that is the purpose of this series and also this network. It's not only open to those that were in the Pohang Knowledge Exchange, but to everyone who was invited and could not attend, plus their teams and the wider network across the steel value chain. UNIDO will provide the structure for this webinar series and the network, but the network is intentionally decentralized, and we have outlined the first topics, as you see on the right side of the slide, but we hope partners and participants of this network will feel free to shape future sessions as well. These webinars will help guide where the Pohang Network should focus next and how we can prepare for our next in-person exchange as well. Today's session will revisit some key themes of Pohang, policy signals, technology developments, and early project pipelines, and we'll place them in the context of global discussions on low-carbon steel. So having said this, let me welcome my colleague Sarbajit Pal, who will guide us through today's session and set the scene for the conversation ahead of us. Sarbajit, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ines, and welcome everybody once again to today's workshop, Knowledge Exchange. And it's a conversation that we, as Ines mentioned, that we started a few months back and we are taking forward now. This is an evolving discussion. It's a very fast evolving landscape as well when we talk about the steel sector. So this is a conversation that we would like to continue going forward. There have been, even in the few months since we had the knowledge exchange in Pohang, also quite significant transitions and transformations that we have been seeing. More and more projects are reaching FIDs. We are also getting to learn about challenges that different projects around the world are facing. We have accomplished a fantastic COP30 in Belém just earlier last month. And I think, there is a clear indication that mitigation actions are a bit of a priority for countries, even if it doesn't appear in the negotiated outcomes, but certainly in the nationally determined contributions that different countries are submitting. And across the board, it is clear that the steel sector, which holds a significant share of the emissions from the industrial sector output, is already kind of taking a good amount of leadership in transforming and transitioning, although there are lots of global headwinds in this space. So today we have two very knowledgeable, insightful speakers with us, Yesan Choski from Agora Industry and Anna Song from the Mission Possible Partnership, who will take us through the global landscape as the first part of this webinar series. Without further ado, we'll get into the presentations. So I would like to introduce Yesan. Can we maybe kind of bring her to the screen? Yesan is the steel sector lead for Agora Industry. And today she's going to kind of give us a bit of a flavor with regards to what it implies for achieving carbon or climate neutral steel by 2050. But before we get into her slide and presentation, a quick check from the community here through a poll, which should pop up now on your screen. What is the sense that you have with regards to the current projects which have been announced that are already kind of indicating the hydrogen-based direct reduction iron as an option for reducing the emissions footprint from their output, and which are the regions do you think that are leading in this space? Is it Latin America and Southeast Asia, or is it Europe and the MENA region? Is it specifically China and India? Or is it North America? These were the groups that we had, split us amongst us in Pohang. So thoughts on this? You could mark your, you could submit your answers directly online. Ines, you can give me a bit of a go ahead once you have adequate number of responses. Yeah, I think I can also see the responses. Okay. So yes, I think there is a general sense that Europe and the MENA region are probably leading this transition with a large number of hydrogen-based DRI projects coming up there. But is that true? Yesen, over to you to take us through some insights with regards to how this sector is transforming.
Hi there. So just to reintroduce myself, my name is Izan Shoksi. I work for Agora Industry. I am the global lead for steel industry at Agora, and I work on projects to do with scenario analysis, so looking at how we decarbonize steel by 2050, so in terms of technologies, but also approaches to emissions, and what is the policy mix that would be needed in order to achieve net zero or climate neutral steel by 2050. So I wanted to start off by talking about emissions. So one of the things that we've recently done is we've produced a paper ahead of COP30. So this is relatively recent, about a month old. We produced a piece of analysis that looked at the scenario of decarbonisation of steel by 2050. And what we found in that paper was firstly one of the big pieces of analysis was that we think that emissions in the steel sector has actually already peaked. We saw a slight peak happening in 2021, and that's what this slide is essentially trying to show you. So in 2021, we had the highest level of emissions since we started recording it in Agora, and you can see that slight peak in 2021. And since then, over the last couple of years to 2024, you can see a slight movement downwards in that curve. And what that's trying to imply essentially is that we have had a small reduction in emissions. But what we also show in this slide is the production routes for steel making. The vast majority of steel today is made through the integrated blast furnace route, which you can see here shown in black. And then you have also scrap EAF on top of it, which is a much lower carbon route. A lot less emissions are produced through scrap-based EAF. But what you see with this slide is that though emissions are slightly coming down, the production routes in terms of how much steel is produced through different production routes haven't changed. So the vast majority of steel is still produced through BF-BOF, around about 70%. Around about 22% is produced via scrap-based EAF. Around about 8% is produced through DRI, that is natural gas-based. And so these percentages haven't really changed. And so what we're trying to say is essentially that emissions may have peaked in 2021, but that story is a story of production decreasing rather than production routes changing, which is what we need in order to decarbonize steel. We need to move steel out from being made through the BF-BOF and to sectors that are much cleaner, like, for instance, hydrogen-based DRI and more scrap-based EAF. So this is what we can see with this slide. So we have seen a 1% reduction since 2021. However, if we look at activity change by 2030, we don't see very much reduction at all unless we actually start looking at the switches to different production routes that are much less emissions intensive. So on the right-hand side of the screen, what you can see is what our prediction is for the amount of emissions reductions by 2030, based on our analysis. By 2030, we think that around 5% of emissions will be reduced in the steel sector. And that's partly because of essentially a stagnating amount of blast furnace production. So blast furnaces, we think, will not go up massively, partly because of blast furnaces being shut down in China. We have around 100 million tons that we predict by 2030 will be shut down in terms of capacity use in China, but that will almost be completely made up by blast furnaces coming online in India and also Southeast Asia. However, we do predict a switch from blast furnace over to secondary steel. So secondary steel, scrap-based EAF of minus 50 million tons. So 50 million tons less BF-BOF and more EAF. And then a switch to low carbon iron as well. And that low carbon iron would be a switch from blast furnaces over to natural gas DRI, which does some emissions reductions, and a blast furnace switch to natural gas DRI that will turn into hydrogen by 2030 of 10 million tons, and a blast furnace switch to H2 DRI straight away, so hydrogen-based DRI straight away. So that's around 50 million tons of scrap-based DRI turning off those blast furnaces, and 50 million tons of low carbon iron also turning off those blast furnaces as well. So with that 100 million tons less blast furnaces online, we see around a 5% reduction. However, that leaves us a long way off from the emissions reductions that we need by 2050, which is net zero steel or climate neutral steel by 2050. So this is a pathway analysis. What we're trying to show is what we see as the major technologies that will serve on the way to climate neutral steel. And part of that will be done by increasing the amount of scrap. As I said before, we have around 22% scrap-based EAF steel, but that we predict needs to go up to 40 to 50% in order to achieve climate neutral steel. But that leaves another 1,000 million tons of production, because in our models, we don't see we don't see the need for more production of steel, or that much more production of steel than we're already producing per year. We think it will be around 2 billion tons needed by 2050. So if half of that, around 1,000 million tons, is being produced by scrap, then about half of it, or 1,000 million tons, will be needed to produce by primary steel making. So the question is, what are the technologies that we will be needing for that? And this gives you a sense of the major competitors for what that technology is. Firstly, on the left-hand side, we can see DRI. So DRI, or direct reduction iron, I'm sure you are all aware of this technology. It's been around for around 50 years, mostly operated in the MENA region, mostly operated in places where you have access to very cheap natural gas. And DRI can be done using 100% hydrogen, and hydrogen produced via renewables energy. So that is the idea for how to decarbonize primary steel production completely. The other, which was a wish of the steel industry for a long time, especially here in Europe, spent about 20 years or 15 to 20 years trying to make CCS, post-combustion CCS, work on a blast furnace. What that would mean is you don't have to do much capacity shifting. In fact, you just posthumously CCS on top of a blast furnace in order to catch the carbon and then store it somewhere else. However, what we've seen is that no FIDs have really materialized in post-combustion CCS on a commercial scale, whereas on the other side of the graph, you can see that about 89 million tons of commercial scale projects have materialized in the DRI or the hydrogen-based DRI pipeline. So what we're trying to say with this slide is essentially when steel companies are asked to actually make this decision, or are made to make this decision through a carbon price mechanism, for instance, they will choose DRI technology because CCS simply isn't there yet. So just to give you an idea about where this is happening all over the world. But what's interesting about this is it's a bit deceptive, because the vast majority of projects, almost all of them, are CBAM related projects, which means that even if they're happening outside of the EU, most of them are hoping that their offtake market will be inside of the EU. And that the reason is that we don't see demand for green steel taking off elsewhere because lack of a fixed carbon price and the end of freelancers for industry. So that 89 million tons, just to drill down into it a little bit in more detail. So we already have around 27 million tons that's under construction, 5 million tons that's already been completed, and around 13 million tons additional FIDs, so final investment decisions. 44 million tons is still just in the announcement phase, but we're hoping that more of them will move towards FID by 2027, so they can be built out by 2030. So just to give you a bit more of a regional perspective, what are the regions that are leading in this? And this was already in the poll that you had earlier. So where we see the vast majority of announcements, FIDs under construction and completed projects are either in Europe or in the MENA region as well, so Middle East and North Africa. So Europe has been leading, the Europe 27 has been leading in terms of announcements and construction of H2 DRI. In the last few years. The reason for that is quite obvious. The reason is that companies are having to make decisions about decarbonising their primary steel production as well as their secondary steel production as well. So when they're being asked to make those investments, they are going for DRI, H2-based DRI. So we do see that there are a number of projects that have been stalled, and I think we'll go into that a little bit later. In the MENA region, however, we see that more of them are moving ahead. And these are, vast majority of them are EU CBAM focused projects. So we are only really looking at projects that have a H2 component, so that have a hydrogen component. We do not see natural gas, DRI, in of itself as a decarbonisation technology. So on the right-hand side, you can see the DRI project pipeline via the fuel type. So we're trying to break this down and show that in the MENA region, for instance, we have more natural gas DRI that has a target to move towards H2 DRI, but that target is undefined. Whereas in the EU, we have 16 million tonnes that's going to go straight to hydrogen-based DRI, and a further 10 million tonnes that has a 2030 target, and then another 8 million tonnes that will be natural gas DRI with an undefined hydrogen target into the future. And having spoken to producers who are producing in the MENA region, they are thinking about CBAM as being the main instigator of showing them when their timeline has to actually move towards H2 DRI. So the reason we want to focus so much on hydrogen is because natural gas DRI in of itself is not a way to deliver climate neutral steel by 2050. We think, best case scenario, you can reduce about 50% of emissions when compared to the blast furnace, but we cannot stop at a halfway transition. The reason you can only go halfway with natural gas DRI, firstly, natural gas is a fossil fuel. Secondly, with upstream emissions and also midstream emissions, especially when you're talking about Europe-based natural gas-based DRI, which has to come through very, very long pipelines over thousands of kilometers, or through LNG, which is also a highly fossil fuel intensive process, you're talking about a lot of emissions that happen at extraction and a lot of emissions that happen also in the midstream as well, through the pipelines and through the LNG route. Methane is between 80 and 120 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 itself. However, if you get rid of methane tomorrow, methane combusts or degrades at a much faster rate. So you can get rid of the climate inducing factor of methane within around 20 years. So if we got rid of all methane today, we could about save about 0.5 degrees of warming by 2050. So NGDRI in of itself cannot be seen as a full transition. So where are we with the hydrogen project pipeline? Well, we're not really where we need to be. So H2, there is enough for the entire 2030 project pipeline for climate neutral steel to be fueled by hydrogen. However, a lot of those projects, we have 26 million tons in the project pipeline, but a lot of those projects are not moving forward to FID. Partly because the policy framework isn't there, partly because low carbon hydrogen production costs are higher than we expected 2 years ago, and partly because transferring hydrogen is very difficult via ships, which is also why we have another project thinking about how to embody hydrogen in HBI or hot briquetted iron and move iron as a globally traded good. But we do see that the steel industry can be the off-taker for hydrogen and spur more of those FIDs. So this diagram is trying to show that with 39 million tons of DRI under construction or FID now, by 2030, this can create an offtake of around 2.7 million tons of hydrogen that can move towards FID. So we're trying to really push the steel industry to be the key industry off-taker for green hydrogen, because steel, other routes have other options, but steel really needs hydrogen to fully decarbonize. But what are we talking about in terms of the project pipeline? It's going to be difficult to achieve, but not impossible. What we're talking about is the vast majority of primary steel decarbonization should be done via the H2 DRI route. It's partly because we do not see progress in the BF-BOF with post-combustion CCS. And we also see other technologies like, for instance, electro steel or the direct electrification route as not delivering the time for the amount of capacity injection that we need by 2050. So even though MOE as a technology is really exciting, so molten oxide electrolysis, we do see it as an exciting new technology. We don't see it as being commercially viable until, for instance, about 2035, which means that within 15 years, we're not going to be able to produce 1,000 million tons of molten oxide electrolysis to deliver that climate neutral steel, which means that H2 DRI is, for us, we're putting the thumb on the scales for that technology delivering us climate neutral steel by the timeline we need. This is another potential bottleneck, high-grade iron ore that is needed, but actually in our paper, we show that development of new iron ore mining projects, building more more DRI smelt BOF plants, and also beneficiating more iron ore on site can remove that as a major bottleneck to the DRI pipeline. How are we going to do this? We're going to do it through a mixture of steel companies making the investments, but they will only make the investments if they are incentivized to do that with a policy toolbox along the entire steel value chain. I won't go into it too much, but basically what we provide here is a very high level policy toolbox that goes through the energy infrastructure, the ramping up of supply of the DRI plants itself, and also scaling demand for that green steel as well. And trying to provide essentially a whole of value chain approach to the policy matrix that's going to be needed to deliver climate neutral steel. These are the stakeholders, policy and institutions, industry and associations, as well as financial institutions and technology providers, as well as communities and labour organisations will all be needed to deliver this change. We turned this into a call to action ahead of COP, and that call to action was to send a strong signal to policymakers that they needed to act in order to deliver carbon neutral steel. And in fact, in the end, we had 8 companies join our call to action, showing that they were very interested in sending a strong signal to policymakers at COP30 to deliver climate neutral steel through policies. Okay, I will hand over back to Sarbajit. Thank you.
Yes, Naveen, that was very, very rich and very, very informative. I think it is a very fast-changing landscape. I think even between August and now, with the analysis that you have, new analysis which has kind of emerged, I think some of these insights are quite interesting. I think a few things which, of course, struck out is you did mention that much of CBAM or the impact of CBAM. Could you maybe tell us a little more about what you mean by it? We have audiences who are joining from different parts of the world. So do you want to kind of explain this a bit more? What is this CBAM and how is it changing the steel industry?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the carbon border adjustment mechanism will be starting as of next year, and the idea is that it places a kind of import tax, for want of a better term, on products that are being produced via a high carbon route coming into Europe. The idea is to prevent too much carbon leakage and also incentivize both domestic companies to decarbonize and also international companies to decarbonize. And what's really interesting is I think that the international investments in decarbonizing or decarbonized products is something that European policymakers didn't really have front of mind, but it's something that's happening and it's something that needs to be emphasized to a large extent as well. Because CBAM is having an effect on an international basis. So if companies want to be importing or exporting to the EU as of 2035, for instance, they will have to pay a carbon tax or a carbon price on blast furnace based steel production that will be around about 200 euros per ton. So the reason, if they have no carbon price at home, and the reason for that is if we estimate that CO2 or the carbon price goes up to around 100 euros per ton of CO2, and the blast furnace route produces around, on average, 2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel, then it's around 200 euros of extra costs on top of blast furnace production. So that's why if you're wanting to do long-term exports to the EU, you're going to have to invest in low carbon technologies in order to do that. And what we see is happening is that is what is happening. So we have companies like Meranti Steel, like Vulcan Steel. Vulcan comes from Jindal Steel in India. They are making investments in H2 DRI, specifically for those two companies in Oman, in the Duqm port area, in order to produce steel and in order to produce iron as well that will be exported to the EU, to the CBAM region. And their timeline in terms of introducing hydrogen as fully as possible is very much attached to the CBAM. So with the price of carbon, as the price of carbon goes up, the more hydrogen they will use. And if the price of carbon doesn't go up, or if natural gas DRI, for instance, is accepted as a low carbon steel product, then they will stay on natural gas. And we have methane based DRI, which European steelmakers cannot compete with. And as well, it doesn't deliver us the climate neutral steel that we need by 2050. So that's how CBAM is having an international effect. But CBAM cannot absorb all green steel. That's really important to note. And I think that other large steel producers and consumers need to step up and also produce either their own carbon price or their own policy mix that incentivizes their own buyers and also makers to invest in primary and secondary decarbonized steel. So I'm talking about Japan, South Korea, China especially, really incentivizing that through a policy mix of their own, because CBAM cannot absorb all the green steel in the world.
Thanks, Yasen. I think you make a very, very important point, which is a good segue to our next presentation. Actually, like, given the fact that yes, CBAM is making transformative changes possible, it's probably kind of sparking a change. But given the fact that going into the future, a large volume of the demand is actually going to be in other regions of the world, I think it needs to kind of also stem from the change. Also needs to stem from those future demand centers. And that also kind of reflects in the the new clean industrial projects which are lining up. So just to kind of get a bit of a sense check in the house, how many clean industrial projects do we currently feel are ongoing globally? Our colleagues at the Mission Possible Partnership, and I'll be handing over to Anna shortly, have been doing a bit of tracking with regards to how many the state of play for clean industrial projects globally. Does the group feel, the participants, do you feel how many projects are currently ongoing globally? About 100, 300, 1,000 or even more? I think we are gravitating gradually to about 1,000. I'll turn to you, Anna, to tell us whether that's about right or not. But just before moving, how many of these projects are possibly in the steel sector? I somehow feel probably very few, right? Like, given what you have been saying, Yasen, like, only 89 million metric tons we are talking about in the pipeline for clean steel products. Okay, so 25 to 100. I don't know the answers to these questions. I'll turn to Anna from the Mission Possible Partnership to take us through and share her thoughts from the analysis that you guys have been doing at MPP. So over to you, Anna. Can you share with us your thoughts about how many projects are going on globally? What is the analysis showing, and how many of these are steel?
Sure, fantastic. Thank you for that intro, Savajit. For everyone, good morning. My name is Anna Song. I'm Career Engagement Lead at Mission Possible Partnership. But today we are, of course, talking about sort of the global perspective. And for those of you who may not have heard about Mission Possible Partnership as an organization, we look at industry decarbonization by engaging with industry value chain activities and how to reach the final investment decision phase of these projects in the pipeline to build a critical mass of clean industry projects around the world. So Mission Possible Partnerships and Industry Transition Accelerator launched a global project tracker back in 2024. And in Pohang, we shared the tracker gets updated twice a year. In Pohang, we shared the June numbers, and I'm very happy to start sharing with you the November update, which was launched in Brazil last month. So the poll showed the audience is very clued in to some of the trends at the moment. Our global project tracker is currently tracking 1,000 projects globally. Of those, 144 are already secured final investment decision or are built and operating, and they represent the entire 1,000 projects being tracked. They represent over $1.8 trillion of investment opportunity to be locked in these economies. So we track 7 heavy industry you see there, from fuels to commodity products like steel. And just for the perspective on the update, back in June, we tracked 800 plants. So there's additional 200, and I'll get into the nuance of that in a minute. But for our global project tracker, we also updated some of our categories and thresholds. So previously, we categorized sort of clean, critical technologies as up to 75% of emissions reduction. But now we have sort of scrutinize that more, and up to from 70 to 80% reduction is categorized as critical clean industry technology in our tracker. So on the next slide, we found that across the 1,000 that we're tracking across the world, the 19 projects that have been financed this year, out of those, 12 came from China. So in the past year, we are seeing a trend of across all 7 industry, China playing a bit of a leadership role. And the pace is also being a bit faster with that being the case. We are also seeing that outside of China, we are still seeing a lot of opportunity for investment into the projects in the pipeline, about 70 projects that are ready to be unlocked with around US $140 billion investment opportunity. You can see there that we have broken down the number of pipeline projects by announcement that are a bit more progressed and poised for finance, securing finance, and those who have successfully secured finance, and those already operating. So you can see those breakdowns on the slide. Just for a bit of context, this number of FID projects has taken about a decade to reach. So I think it's showing that the clean industry transition is really taking up a pace. And some of that, if you go to the next slide, we are seeing concentrated in some of the fuel sectors. So ammonia is leading across the 7 heavy industries, and methanol and aviation. So industry sort of SAF fuel is leading the final investment decision, as well as the critical 70 to 80% emissions decarbonized technologies in these sectors. Steel, unfortunately, is still a bit slower, and that is one of the reasons that our global tracker update in November has introduced complementary approaches, which has increased the number of projects we're tracking from 800 to 1,000. And I'll get to the details of that specifically to the steel sector in a bit. But if we go to the next slide, what Isan has already mentioned about some of the challenges of making these projects bankable. There is what she mentioned about some of the policy levers like CBAM showing demand signals. But what we're also finding is that there are a spectrum, a number of reasons that can make a project more bankable. So competitiveness and climate resilience of a market or country, also highlighting that these technologies are proven and can deliver these emission reductions are really helping, and the business case being de-risked by some of the government policy levers and institutions backing the projects. They are really, it's a combination of those factors. They're helping to move these projects to be more bankable. So now turning to the next slide to look specifically at the steel sector, the poll sort of, again, was quite on the money about the number of projects we're tracking in the steel sector. We have tracked 7 critical decarbonization steel projects, so 70 to 8% emissions reduction reaching FID, 7 of them in China and Europe, and 15 remain announced in the pipeline. So overall, we're tracking 22 projects in the steel industry. That amounts to a bit over 40 million tons per year. For the November update, we were able to capture some of the numbers coming out of China. So 4 reaching FID. And on this number, we really invite some reactions and also any further insights from this community of practice on this. Germany and Sweden also have projects that have reached FID, and really across the geographies around the world in rest of Europe, Australia, Asia, and Africa, there are announced projects. If we go to the next slide. In the June tracker, we aggregated some of the in progress, not yet reached FID into sort of one group. But one of the updates from the November tracker is that we added those complementary approaches quickly mentioned earlier, which are in addition to the critical decarbonized pathways, circular, first big steps, and last mile reductions. So if you look at the right-hand side, for the steel industry specifically, the circular refer to the standalone EAFs. The big first steps refer to coming off of coal-based BF-BOF and into gas DRI. Some with concrete plans for transition, as Isan mentioned, some without, and some with CCS projects for the capture rate. The last mile projects we're tracking really reveal to some of the fuel switches, including use of hydrogen and biofuels as well. So that has increased the total number of the projects we are tracking under the steel sector, because we want to sort of bring to light what is happening on the ground in the industry. If we look at the next slide, some of you might be wondering, why is it that some of the fuel-driven sectors like ammonia and aviation are showing so much faster progress for FID compared to steel? And looking at some of the analysis that makes those projects bankable, we have identified those sector mandates as a big driver that pushes FIDs. So for the ammonia and SAF, aviation industry, you can see on the right-hand side the examples of the shipping sector and aviation sector having made those policy, the mandate commitments, which has driven the demand and led the bankability of those sectors. So in the next slide, consistent with some of Isan's analysis, one of the challenges with hydrogen-based transition for the steel industry is the short-term cost of hydrogen for the hydrogen-based transition. But we are, and others as well, are looking at how the cost of that sort of green premium on green hydrogen will cascade down by 2030 when we look at the end consumer products. So for the passenger vehicle, for example, you see on the right-hand side, it would be quite a small percentage of green premium at that level, which should stimulate some of the demand for the producers who are facing currently a big green premium as a bit of a challenge. In the next slide, we also did some mapping of locations on where the low carbon DRI projects are happening globally. So again, these track some of the complementary technologies such as gas DRI with and without plans for transition, as well as green hydrogen DRI reduction plants. And these, just to note, these are quite recent analysis. So do check in with us if you wish to make them useful for your own work. And if you go to the next slide, it shows how while these DRI plants are concentrated on sort of the top part of the world, the Sunbelt economies where solar and wind availability, the capacity of renewable energy is favorable. The levelized costs, the cost competitiveness of producing lower carbon DRI will be competitive for the Sunbelt economies in the Southern Hemisphere, as you see, for the producers in the north. So if we look at the entire global value chain, the low carbon DRI clean industry projects really has the investment potential that are quite global and widespread around the world. So I hope this will keep some of you engaged on our Build Clean campaign, which I'll mention in a bit. But just for those of you interested in some of the case studies of the project level steel sector work that we're doing, we have, for example, one in Sweden, which has reached FID Stegra, and another one, Moranti, which is at announcement phase. So this is some of the approach that our tracker takes for that pipeline plant-to-plant approach. And the Build Clean Now campaign is open for governments, investors, and producers in the business to commit to that ambition of quickening the pace of getting these projects financed and operational, because at the moment, while the investment potential to unlock is there and it's a big market, the pace is slow. So we need not dozens, but hundreds of these projects to be financed in order for all of us to reach our climate goal. So I hope all of you will stay engaged with us on the Build Clean Now campaign as well. I'll leave it there for now. Sabajit.
Thank you so much. And I think, again, very rich, very insightful, lots of takeaways. And I think, participants would also take a fair bit of time to absorb a lot of the, content and material as well. But I think a few things which definitely, pop out is this whole, Sunbelt analysis that you have been doing at Mission Possible Partnership. I think it's very interesting where the clean energy transition and this overall industrial transition has tremendous, possibilities for kind of being overlaid. I think the slides are getting updated. Could you tell us with regards to this Build Clean Now campaign, what's planned? How can industry representatives, organizations join this campaign? What's the idea behind the campaign?
Yeah, so the global launch of Build Clean Now happened around the New York Climate Week this year. And the approach is now that in each country level, we launched the campaign with a workshop that brings government, investors and businesses, producers and so forth together. So that has happened in Australia and India in the region already. And we have plans for more country level launch of Build Clean Now happening between now and next COP31 as well. So the model of Mission Possible Partnership is, as our name indicates, working with partners, but having also a footprint on the ground. So we will activate, I think, about another 10 countries for Build Clean Now national level workshop campaign launches until next COP. So stay tuned for that.
Sure. Thanks. We'll definitely be kind of supporting this exercise going forward. And I think many from also the steel sector would be interested to be engaged in the process. So we'll share more information about this campaign. And also, I think what Yesan mentioned earlier, there is this collective, call to action. I think would be welcoming, different parties to kind of join both the call to action as well as the Build Clean Now campaign. Now, speaking about, coming back to core steel issues, we have been kind of speaking to different, bankers over the course of course, this last year and a half, while momentum has been picking up on analyzing the different kinds of projects. Anna, what's your take with regards to, project bankability that you were talking about earlier? What are the key factors which are ensuring that clean industrial projects, and maybe if you have insights also from the steel sector, what make projects really bankable? Is there a role that governments directly need to play to kind of back these projects, or do you think there is already enough justification for commercial viability for many of these projects?
Sure. So as mentioned in the presentation, because it's still yet to have a policy lever such as a mandate for the steel sector, the CBAM carbon border adjustment is definitely playing a role in indicating that demand, the forecast of demand. So that persuades off-takers that they need to actually see the opportunity from that policy signal and translate that into an investment into a project. But that in it itself is a bit difficult, and the pace is still yet to catch up. So government procurement policy lever is another complementary one at a policy level. The demonstration of some of the technology and the actual emissions reduction that those technology pathways are delivering is also another good proof point for bankability of steel projects. And some of the government-backed financial mechanisms are also helping to de-risk private investors in case the speed of demand in the market for green steel is slower than what the current policy levers are indicating. But that's why we're also doing the green premium cascade at a consumer level analysis as well, because if it's sort of socialized, for lack of a better word, among consumers that buying, for example, a car that has green steel is not going to add pressure of that green premium at a consumer level by 2030 or so, that opens up the market confidence for more demand for those products with green steel. So I think it's happening at multiple levels.
Thanks, Anna. I think this is a good segue for us to kind of also mention that we did touch upon quite a few of these policy drivers and levers that you reference, whether it's kind of the demand pull, or whether it's about specific kinds of incentives from the policy side, which would be very critical for moving this sector forward. And of course, like other policy levers, including border carbon adjustment mechanisms, would be other measures by which this industry could possibly transform and quickly. We do also recognize that there are current global headwinds for the steel sector right now, so we will continue to kind of keep assessing and keep analyzing the sector. I know that we are at the end of the hour that we had blocked for this webinar. There are participants who have questions to ask. I think we'll take maybe a couple of questions in the Q&A before closing, so that it's not just 100% one-way conversation. So I'll just check if there are people who would like to raise any specific questions. You can type your question in on the chat in the Q&A function, if at all. I see a hand up, Janardana. Janardana, do you mind typing your question in the Q&A? Or maybe Inez, can you unmute Janardana for a moment? Yes, Janardana, you should be able to speak right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So when you say the de-risking projects, why you have not approached of creating a de-risking facility for steel itself, and also creating a project preparation facility to create a good project pipeline? And the second point is, when you say DRI technology, what are the technology transfer issues that countries are facing? Do countries have technology action plans actually in terms of ambition and implementation? Have you identified any of the gaps here?
Thanks, Janardana. Very good questions. I think on the second one, I'll probably turn to you, Isan, if you have any thoughts and suggestions with regards to the approaches that you are seeing with specifically with these DRI technologies, and maybe for the first part of the question. To you, Anna, have you seen, as part of this whole project analysis that you have been doing, are there special facilities which are being set up to be able to kind of de-risk, and if so, what are those? Any thoughts, Anna, before I come to you, Isan?
As mentioned, because there are multiple, I'll be kind of cherry picking to be mentioning one, but I think in the recent sort of government commitments. For example, the Australian government announcing a green iron sort of fund that sort of highlights that industry to investors as one that is showing a real green signal for some de-risking with government-backed funding. So I think that has stimulated some conversations, and that has led to a small producer such as Green Steel Progressive Green Steel getting 100% offtake MOU, so an Australian producer from a German offtake MOU. So I think it's a number of those enablers working together. Once you kind of had one, not unlike a domino effect, it starts to stimulate other activities.
Thanks, and I think this is also something that we need to capture in the next iteration of the discussions. And yes, and over to you. Technology transfer, very kind of important topic, given the fact that what we are seeing that the Sunbelt has to make the transition. They may not have all the technologies in place. So what's happening with regards to DRI?
Hi there. So with DRI, it's a 50-year-old technology, so it does exist in the world outside of Europe, luckily. So DRI is not really a technology we're worried about in terms of being hoarded in high-income countries, because it's been rolled out successfully and commercially viably since the 1970s in places like Iran, and also in the Middle East and MENA region more broadly. So I think what's interesting about the question that was just asked on de-risking, and also the question from Kapil in the chat as well, is we have to think more broadly about de-risking along the entire value chain, and also depending on the project makeup itself. So for instance, when we're talking about green iron projects that will be built out in the Sunbelt region, we are asking policymakers to think about that in terms of strategic partnerships between countries, facilitating the ability of companies to invest, for instance, from Europe into places like Brazil, South Africa, Canada, and so forth, through de-risking mechanisms. So thinking more broadly about de-risking, it's not just about commercial banks seeing bankability and viability of a certain project, but also thinking about the role that, for instance, credit unions and also de-risking, intergovernmental de-risking mechanisms and multilateral banks can also perform as well in de-risking projects from countries that are outside of Europe or that are outside of Japan or Korea, which we see in the future as being other large off-takers of green iron. And to come to Kapil's project, this shows that we cannot be just dependent on public funding for the steel transition. The taxpayer cannot be required to decarbonize the entirety of primary steel or even secondary steel. And what Kapil's question is asking is basically, why are we seeing funding being given back to certain governments because steel companies do not want to invest in H2 DRI? I would narrow it down and say that's a steel company, and it's a multinational steel company that doesn't have strict geographical ties to a European base, right? So when you're talking about a company like ArcelorMittal that has worldwide footprint, they don't necessarily need to be investing in Europe, whereas ThyssenKrupp Steel is based in Duisburg. It's a geographically located company that needs to be investing in its own region in order to be seen as having a license to operate by the German people, but also by the German government as well. So that's one of the reasons why ArcelorMittal has been backing out. I think also it shows that ArcelorMittal sees that without government support to actually not just help with the capital costs of building out a DRI plant, but also help with the build out of the renewables electricity that will be needed, the hydrogen pipelines, the hydrogen access to green hydrogen that will be needed, for instance. Without all of that, steel companies will not be able to make a turn on investment. And so they will be very dependent on natural gas, which is extremely expensive. It comes from either Texas or it comes from Azerbaijan, or it comes from Russia. And these are all places that are, unstable in terms of the relationships that we have with them geopolitically. So we cannot be dependent on natural gas. It's far too expensive and it's far too politically unstable and geopolitically unstable to be dependent on, which is why, long-term goals to be dependent on natural gas are really not good for European steelmakers. And ArcelorMittal doesn't see the help with hydrogen, and therefore it sees itself producing DRI elsewhere. We hope, as Agora, that in the future, ArcelorMittal can be an example of green iron trade happening within a commercial entity in of itself, producing green iron somewhere where it makes economic sense and viability to do so, and then transporting that over to their EAF productions to make high quality steel in Europe, because their EAF projects are moving forward. We saw breaking ground in Ghent, for instance, just a few weeks ago in the EAF project that they have there. So they are investing in EAFs, but they're not investing in DRIs.
Thanks, yes, and I think this is, of course, like all of this is extremely interesting, and we can carry on this conversation much longer. But sadly, we'll have to kind of do a wrap today. We have a few more questions. Sarah asked about the availability of scrap. It's a long-standing item of discussion. I mean, if you're talking about 50% from scrap, where is it going to come from? Stuff like this, we will try and unpack through the discussions that we hope that we'll continue through this Pohang Network Knowledge Exchange on steel. And in that context, just wanted to kind of flag that this is one of the webinar series that we have launched today, but there are some of the other webinar series which are kind of currently ongoing. A new webinar series from the Global Matchmaking Platform, which I'm heading up, is also going to be launched on the 10th of December, where we'll be talking a little more with a bit of a more macro lens about the discussions that countries, partners, different institutions and financiers are committing to through their NDCs for implementing these NDCs. So watch the space. I know, Hugo, you asked a question related to this. So I think it's probably a moment that we'll hear from the different UN organizations who have been kind of tracking the NDCs to see how they're planning to support countries for implementation. And then UNIDO's own Net Zero Partnership for Industry Decarbonization has also launched a little more technical webinar series to get into some of the deep dives for industrial decarbonization strategies. And we have had one just last week, and we'll be having another one in Q1 of 2026. So we'll keep all of you informed. But most importantly, this knowledge exchange is a continuing process as it pertains to steel and the steel sector. We will be taking up the policy levers for incentivizing steel decarbonization, along with the other topics which have been referenced today, including the issues with regards to trade and tradability of steel, and both upstream as well as downstream, in subsequent webinars under this series. So thank you once again, specifically for Ihsan and Anna for your insights, very, very valuable slides, presentations, numbers, facts, figures. As participants have requested, we will be these with the participants, but also make them available online on the Pohang Knowledge Exchange webpage, which we'll be sharing shortly. And watch the space for more information with regards to this. And Ines and Walker, who have been behind the scene, Ines, front of the screen, who have made this webinar possible. Thanks once again to everyone for your time today. Sad we did a bit of an overrun. We'll try to keep to 1 hour for the next iteration. Thanks once again. Switching off now.